from these curves, these histograms, from all the, you measure stuff and then you plot it like this. This is the frequency of whatever you're measuring, and this is, let's say if this is LDL cholesterol, this is the LDL, this is how many people have a certain LDL, and often it comes out in a normal, so-called normal or Gaussian distribution, and from this distribution you can figure out the mean, right? And you can figure out the variance, which is the spread of the data, right? And the spread of the data is defined as the square root of the variance is defined as the square root of sigma, which is the standard deviation. So the standard deviation is calculated. So here's how you calculate a standard deviation. Don't worry about this. So you take the difference between each value and the mean, right? And then you square that, and then you take the mean of the squares, right? That's the variance, and then you take the square root of the variance, and that's your standard deviation. Now you don't have to remember that, okay? Because this results in a rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb is that when you get one standard deviation is going to end up capturing in a bell-shaped curve about 68% of people, and the two standard deviations is going to capture around, this is not exact, around 95%, and three standard deviations is going to capture 99.75%, something like that. So, that's just a rule. So you don't have to remember, how to calculate a standard deviation. Now, not everything comes out as a bell shape, right? Some things are skewed, like length of hospital stays. So then you get, now you can, the mean is still here, which is the average, but the mode is there, and the median, which is, half below and half above, that's there. So you can get all these statistics, and basically, and then you can get normal distribution. Not everything is going to be skewed like a bell-shaped curve or a skewed bell-shaped curve. Some things go up logarithmically, or they go up, they get multiplied, like personal incomes. So then you have to plot it as a log normal. And so frequentist statistics basically are, to a statistician, the normal distribution is a complicated formula, natural log, mean, pi, sigma, and it's all raised to the power of each other, and it's just a mathematical way of summing up, these chance events. So from these kinds of numbers, you can create all kinds of formula, which don't have any English meaning to them, unfortunately, like Bayes' theorem, okay? So, for example, the student's t-test, okay, which is a commonly used statistic in medicine. This is the student's t-test formula, and I don't know what that means, but boil it down and it says you have two sets of data, are they different from each other? And that's what the student's t-test is. It's just one example of a statistic. I bring that one up because that's important to us. Now, student, it turns out, wasn't just a brilliant mathematician, he was an experimentalist, okay? And so he invented or inspired half of modern statistics, and, by the way, or not so by the way, for all of those enjoying the beer, we may be drinking something that he invented, for all I know, that's come down through us. And so he invented 3 different barley varieties grown by the 1920s, and that fed all these breakfast eaters, beer drinkers, other wild beasts, and all the people in this room, perhaps, okay? And so he, initially hired by Guinness in 1899, what happened was, see, in the early 1900s, Guinness, I think they went public. And they were brewing 100 million gallons of beer a year, and it's a kind of a finicky process, brewing beer. So if you were a brewer at Guinness, and these brewers at Guinness, if you passed them in the hallway, you'd avert your eyes, because they were, they were hoity-toity high, they were up on the scale. The student was very humble, though. He was a nice guy. So, but if you were a brewer, you really had your hands full to figure this out, to try to keep that beer like Ray likes, right? Okay. So entered Gossett, okay? Gossett was hired as a brewer by Guinness in 1899. He had been hired because Claude Guinness's had a policy of recruiting really smart people, okay, to help brew their beer. And you have to love this guy. He had no formal training in statistics, he was just brilliant, right? And so he figured out that you really needed statistics to figure this out, and there really weren't any tools, or at least not the right tools, for the challenges he faced. So, partly because he was less scared of mathematics than the other brewers, and the other brewers would bring him the problems that needed math. They would bring him the problems, and he was a nice guy. He wasn't that competitive. And so they would bring him these problems, and he figured out statistics, basically. One problem they brought him was degree of saccharin in the malt extract is too low, the beer is too weak. Not good. Okay, degree of saccharin too high, it's too strong, and the shelf life is compromised. Okay, so he focused on this, and he figured out that 130-degree saccharin gave the targeted level of alcohol, and he needed the error to be less than or equal to 0.5. And so he worked out that it might be maintained that malt extract should be estimated within 0.5 to the true result with a probability of 10 to 1, not 21, 10 to 1, okay? And so given the small samples, he wanted to use very small samples because he didn't have a lot, you know, they wanted to do it economically, and he figured out from his statistic, and I really can't explain it to you, that it would take about an N of 4, okay, a sample size of 4 to tell you whether or not that sample is going to keep that beer at that particular level of saccharin. And that's the student's t-test, which turned into the D-distribution, and he was prohibited from publishing under his name, Gossett, and that's why he published it under student. Some of these people published under the name of pupil. He published under student, and that's why we think of this as the student's t-test. It was actually William Gossett. But what is the t-test? Okay, because this is important. Okay, so the t-test is a statistical hypothesis test of statistics, which can be used to determine if two sets of data are significantly different from each other. Okay, if you follow the student's t-distribution, the null hypothesis is supported. Okay, what's the null hypothesis? That there's not going to be a difference. He didn't want a difference between the group. He took small samples, and if it looked like a t-distribution, he could say that this collection of beer is okay. So it wouldn't disprove the null hypothesis. Now, he didn't keep this a secret. He entered the statistics world, and he communicated and actually worked in this guy's lab. Pearson, he was the god of statistics in those days, and he published Biometrica, and he corresponded with Pearson. And he said, well, gee, you know, this is a pretty good test for the brewing of beer. Maybe this is a statistical test that can be applied to, you know, other statistic problems. And so here's where the trouble starts. Okay, so enter R.A. Fisher. Okay, now he had actually met Gossett while he was in Cambridge as an undergraduate, and he was a brilliant mathematician. Okay, and he trained in mathematics, I believe, and he actually ended up proving Gossett's distribution mathematically. Gossett actually couldn't quite understand it. They corresponded. And this is from an article which is very useful, Guinness, Gossett, Fisher, and Small Samples. Now, in the 20s and 30s, fast forward 20 years, in the 20s and 30s, scientists were trying to develop alternative approaches because they didn't like Bayes' theorem. This has always been an issue, that Bayes, you know, you really can't know the prior probability. You know, it's not exact. You know, it's not certain. You know, so they're looking for more certainty, and so Fisher published in 1925 the Statistical Methods of Research Work. It's kind of a compendium of what he had published the previous 12, 13 years on all these other statistical tests, including students' t-distribution, and that's what popularized the p-value, and it plays a central role in his approach. So what is it about? So he said the p-value wasn't 0.1 like Gossett, okay, 10%. He said the p-value should be, if it's going to be statistically significant, it should be p05, okay? So again, deviations exceeding twice, because that's around twice the standard deviation. It's not exact, but it's around twice the standard deviation. So if you're outside twice the standard deviation, okay, we will say that that is formally regarded as statistically significant. Now the p-value is defined as the probability, okay, so you assume that there's no difference. Okay, you take a sample of beer from the large quantity and you say this beer is going to have the same exact saccharin quality or amount than the whole, you know, lot of beer. And I'm proving, and so you're assuming in this test that there's no difference between the groups. That's the test of the null hypothesis. And then you retain a result that's equal to a more extreme that was actually observed, and if it's in that, and so you didn't support the null hypothesis. He proposed it initially as an informal index to be used as a measure of discrepancy between the data and the null hypothesis. It really wasn't inferential at the start, okay? But it didn't take long to become that way, because here's in 1926, he was an agronomist and he was arranging some field experiments, and now he says, personally, I prefer to set a low standard of significance at 5% and ignore entirely all results which fail to reach this level. So when it was proposed, it got attacked. And perhaps the most powerful criticism was that it didn't really take into account the size of the observed effect. A small effect in a study with a large sample size is that it can have the same p-value as a large effect in a small study. That's a big problem. But he pushed on for a non-economic, non-Bayesian approach, saying that, in fact, scientific research is not geared to maximize the profits of Guinness or any particular organization. We're not interested in growing better barley and hops. We're just interested in statistical significance. We make no attempt to evaluate these consequences and do not assume they are capable of evaluation in any currency. Now, if you want to read more about this, the cult of significance, I got a lot of these slides from this book and from a lecture by one of these authors. And they're economists, they're not doctors, but they've applied this not just to economics, but they've also applied it to the law and to medicine. Now, Student, he didn't base his decisions on statistical significance, okay? The important thing is to have a low error, okay? Not to have a significant result, because it's nearly valueless in itself. Experiments at a single station, that is a test of significance on a single set of data, are almost valueless. That's not what counts. What counts is, are you making better beer? And is there a pecuniary advantage to be gained by following the result of the experiment compared with the cost of the new method, compared with any cost of the experiment themselves, So he was much more practical. Now, here's where it really gets tough, and maybe this is why statistics are so hard to understand. Because methods based on this frequentist view of probability also then, in the 30s and 40s, included a method for choosing between hypotheses called the hypothesis test that was introduced by Neiman and Pearson in the 30s. And then these two methods, the p-value and the hypothesis test, were incompatible, but they become so intertwined that they are mistakenly regarded as part of a single coherent approach to statistical inference. So, it also goes by the name of statistical hypothesis testing, null hypothesis statistical testing, statistical hypothesis inference testing. I think this latter one is more for the acronym, than for any other reason, because, take it. So basically, to pounce on tiny p-values and ignore the larger question is to fall prey to the seductive certainty of significance, right? And significance is not an indicator of practical relevance. We should be asking how much an effect is there, not is there an effect, okay? Now, don't rely on the FDA to do this for statins, okay, or any drug. You can't rely on the FDA. Take a look at this statement that I just read in a blog. So this has to do with rejecting. Now, the FDA rejected, okay, a new indication for ZD or ezetimibe to lower the, it was approved for use on the basis of lowering the surrogate marker of risk, but now they wanted to approve for lowering risk of second heart attack because of the IMPROVE-IT trial, which just showed statistically significant positive results. Never mind that mortality was exactly the same in each group. Never mind that the result was quite a small effect. They wanted it approved, so they wanted to change the label so they could market it to prevent to you people to prevent second heart attacks. And they declined it. Not that that has any practical importance because the drug's already in the market and you can all use it for anything you want to use it for. So they can't just advertise it to you that it lowers risk of second heart attack. Bit of a surprise to Dr. Hyatt, who actually recommended for approval. And the reason he's surprised is because he's been sitting on these FDA boards for a while, I guess, and he's saying the discussion of statistical significance versus clinical relevance has come up a number of times, and it seems, okay, that the history has been that the FDA's role is to decide if a study is positive, meaning statistically significantly positive, not clinically relevant positive, and then you leave it up to payers, okay, not the people in this room, guideline committees to decide what's clinically significant or applicable. So you can't trust the FDA, okay, to do what the psychologist is asking, how much of an effect is there, not is there an effect. All the FDA is doing is there an effect, is it statistically significant, and this is unusual for them to actually reject. So with a large amount of data, you are likely to get statistically significant results that are not practically significant. That's the problem. And there's even a word for it, p-hacking. It's in the dictionary, okay? Exploiting, perhaps unconsciously, research degree of sufficiency until the p gets to less than 0.05. So example, that finding seems to have been obtained through p-hacking. The authors dropped one of the conditions so that the overall p-value would be less than 0. Now this happens. Now here's an example, okay? I just found this example. This happens to be in the diabetes world, okay? So everybody knows about empagliflozin. I forget the brand name of that. It's one of those drugs that make you urinate out glucose and lowers the blood sugar, where there's no evidence for any effectiveness in terms of, risk reduction. But now there is, and it's this trial called the empagliflozin cardiovascular outcome event, and this got applause at the meeting when it was presented, and everybody's going on and on about now we finally have a drug besides metformin that actually also lowers the risk, not just the surrogate marker of risk. But look at this. See, now, this is great. Clinicaltrials.gov. So this started in the early 2000s, okay? So you have to register these trials and tell them what you're doing on clinicaltrials.gov. And if you change it, you have to put it in there, okay? So if you go into clinicaltrials.gov, okay, and you look up this EMPAG-REG outcome trial, okay, and then you click, it takes a little while to figure this out. You finally can get the history of it. Okay, it's not right there. You got to go through a couple of clicks and pages. And you finally get the history, and you can see that on December 11, 2014, okay, they changed the outcome measure. They have composite outcomes, a lot of these trials. It's not just heart attack, it's not just death, it's heart attack, death, need for catheterization, et cetera. And so look what they did. They excluded silent MI on December 11, 2014. Okay, the study is published in September 2015 in that great journal, the New England Journal of Medicine. And lo and behold, sure enough, you look at silent MI, empagliflozin, 7 in 1,000, placebo, lower. So I bet that if they added these in, it wouldn't have reached statistical significance and there wouldn't be any applause. So this goes on, this p-hacking. She is a p-hacker because she always monitored data while it is being collected, okay? So look at this paper on, by Jove, what is a clinician to make of Jupiter? Remember Jupiter? Jupiter is the study that looked at a statin to lower CRP. And they stopped the study before 2 years. I think it was 1.9 years or something. And so these authors point out that that is premature. Prematurely truncated trials are notorious for being vulnerable to implausibly large estimates of treatment benefits because they exhibit regression to the mean, meaning that you measure it once, and you measure it again, and you measure it again, and measure it again, and it's going to get towards the mean. So if you keep measuring things, which they do, and under the guise of safety, okay, they monitor these trials under the guise of safety, and as soon as it reaches statistical significance, never mind that it could come right back if they stayed another 3 months, they stop the study early, and by Jove, what should we make of Jupiter? Should we be putting people on statins to lower their CRP? So these things go on. So you can force, these investigators can force a statistically significant p-value by studying large numbers, and so that's why these n's are always in the thousands. Some of these studies have 4,000 or 5,000 people per group, some of them even more. They measure numerous variables, numerous composite outcomes. They don't just measure one thing. And you measure 20 things, the p-value is less than 0.05, you're going to get that at least 1 in 20, maybe more. And then they monitor the data while it's being collected. Furthermore, as she points out in this paper, in their statistics section, p-values computed in frequentist approaches are often misinterpreted in practice. What does she mean? Well, here's a good example from Dr. Thompson, we're back at, all the blue slides are, by the way, Dr. Thompson's. So here's his lecture, and he's pointing out something about the Accord trial here. This is later on in the lecture when he's talking about fibrates, okay? He's talking about fibrates, and he's pointing out that in this pre-specified subgroup, which isn't fair, because once you look at subgroups, you've broken the randomization, so it's really completely unfair to even look at subgroups, but okay, you look at subgroups and you get a p-value of 0.06, okay? If you just look at patients with triglyceride, HDL less than 34, triglyceride greater than 204, you just look at those patients and you don't get a 0.05, you get a 0.06, and so that means that there's a 94% chance that the phenofibrate reduces cardiac effects in this pre-specified subgroup. Well, everybody here knows that's not true because nobody raised their hand for that question. True, it's false, it's completely false. It's called the transposed conditional fallacy, and it's pretty egregious logical error. It's using the p-value as a score. It just doesn't work that way. The p-value, again, is a statistical test to find out whether you've supported or not the null hypothesis. That's all it is, okay? And so if the p-value is, and this is right out of the cardiology literature. I went back and looked this over because we're talking cardiology, it's not, endocrinology. And so I looked at the cardiology literature and experimental methods of randomized controlled trials, clinical trials in cardiology. If the p-value is small, one may conclude that the difference is not likely to be chance, okay? But that doesn't mean that the drug made the difference, okay? That doesn't say anything about the causal relationship. And that's right from the cardiology literature. So let's get back to his third principle, okay? These incredible outcome data, right? Well, half the studies are not statin studies, so we only got to deal with these studies. Well, they're all explanatory randomized controlled trials. They all use frequentist statistics, and they all tested the null hypothesis. Now, what am I talking about? Explanatory trials. So explanatory trials versus pragmatic trials. Explanatory trials ask the question of efficacy. Might the intervention work? They recruit patients in well-resourced settings, ideal settings. They're highly selected, okay? And they get rid of poorly adherent people and people with, multiple problems, right? And so it's not that relevant to clinical practice as opposed to pragmatic trials, which happen out here, okay? And so explanatory trials test efficacy, the ability to produce a desired result. Pragmatic trials would test effectiveness, the degree to which something is successful in producing a desired result. There's a big difference between efficacy and effectiveness. And so making sense of statistics in clinical trial reports, you all might want to take a look at this series. The series isn't done. He's just published part 1 and 2. He points out there is an important distinction between statistical significance and clinical relevance, biological relevance to your patient of a treatment effect. Here, you need to know the magnitude of treatment. You need to know the effect size to know whether this is relevant, not just whether it's statistically significant to merit its use in clinical practice. So, what's the effect size? Okay, well, once again, you're looking at relative risk. You can't know the effect size, okay? So later in the talk, he does present some of the data, when he talks about the other surrogate markers of risk. So this is the CARDS trial in diabetes. So even though you have diabetes, the statins still work. There's a relative risk reduction of 37%, a pretty good p-value. And here's the actual risk reduction. And it goes from about 12% to 8%. So the actual risk reduction is 4%. He looks at the AFCAP. So this is a trial looking at HDL. It works whether the HDL is high or low. Let's just look at the low HDL. It went from here, 8.5 or 9%, down to about 5.5, 6%, so about 3% reduction. Then he also talks about the ASCOT LLA trial. Again, very statistically significant, p 0.0005. Wow, and 36% reduction. Relative, but it goes from a little over 2% to a little over 3%. So there's around a 1.2% reduction. I don't know, that seems pretty trivial when you're talking about explanatory trials testing the null hypothesis. So it's pretty obvious that a very small absolute benefit could be meaningless for patient welfare, I'm afraid to say. And of course, the number will be right only if all the assumptions made by the test were true. Are the assumptions true, right? And that means that you have to make sure the subjects were assigned randomly, and according to this author, once you say that, all these data are invalid. Because I don't know if anybody's participated in some of these randomized controlled trials, these multi-center trials. I mean, people want to get in the treatment group, and so you hold the envelope up to the, they're supposed to be blinded. They're supposed to be randomized into one group or the other, but if they have to have envelopes that actually can't let you see through. That's what investigators do. They'll hold the envelope up to see. So are these studies, really valid? So this issue of causal relationship between the observed difference and the tested treatment, again, lies in the lack of bias in the design and execution of a trial, and these are subject to flawed internal validity, okay? And so here's how you assess an individual study for internal validity. You got to have comparable groups at the start. You got to maintain comparable groups, right? And you can't have a lot of people, you can't have a differential in loss to follow-up, and you can't have an overall high loss to follow-up, okay? So what about these studies? Okay, so randomization, okay? So randomization, this is right from clinical trials in cardiology. In an assessment of the quality of randomization in reported trials in 4 specialty journals, 9% provided an adequate description. Okay. Maintenance, okay. Problem of crossovers from one trial to another using additional non-protocol interventions has also been troublesome, and it's led to this argument in the cardiology world, should we do intention to treat, meaning if the patient drops out, they stay in their intention to treat group. Okay? So you can have a dropout of 30, 40%. I don't know how you interpret that data, and sure enough, the CARDS trial drop-in and dropout rate at 4 years was 37%. So I don't know how valid that is. Too high. And then there's the confounding factors that all trials are subject to, placebo effect, again, regression to the mean, spontaneous improvement or aggravation of the condition, other confounding factors, and you need to have these groups stay identical, and sometimes you can't tell whether they stayed identical. For example, the CARDS trial, 66% of these patients were smokers or past smokers, present or past. You can't figure it out whether, well, maybe more people in the drug intervention stop smoking than people in the non-drug intervention. I don't know, maybe Lipitor makes you stop smoking cigarettes. And then you got the problem of external validity. Conclusions based on clinical trial data are strictly applicable only during the time during which the trial is carried out or for a reasonable period thereafter, yet trial results are used as the basis for intervention decades later. And this is what we're talking about. These are the years of these studies. So we're talking studies that were done in the 80s and 90s, okay? This is decades later. So how relevant are data from the 80s and 90s to 2015? And this is important. Take a look at this. So this is the likelihood of null effects of large NHLBI, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute clinical trials. The likelihood of null effects, meaning the likelihood of supporting the null hypothesis. There's no difference between the groups, okay? You assume there's no difference between the groups, you do this test statistic, and this says there is no difference between the groups. The likelihood of supporting the null effect, okay, has increased over time. And so you can see these studies, these did not support the null effect. These studies are supporting the null effect. And the dividing here is 2000, and I think, is that 2000? Yeah, and that's when clinicaltrials.gov existed. That's when clinical trials, so they're cynically saying that, oh, once you had to register the trial, now the studies aren't coming up positive anymore because you have to register this trial. I think that may be a little cynical. I think maybe this is the explanation, I don't know. Look at the baseline risk of dying of a heart attack. It's just been steadily dropping. So if your baseline risk is already low, it may be harder and harder to show a minimal or teeny treatment effect. So that may be another explanation, not just the fact that these trials have to now be registered, and not all of them are registered. Who are they studying? Okay, so they're studying people with coronary heart disease, high risk, men only, coronary heart disease, renal transplant patients, high risk, CVD, diabetes. So these may not be relevant for primary prevention anyway. And again, the effect size is small even for secondary. And where are these studies happening? They're not happening in Western Massachusetts. Okay, so then you got the issue of duration of benefit. When a trial has been terminated and a benefit has been demonstrated, the question will arise as to whether one can anticipate that the benefit is likely to continue or even disappear in subsequent years, okay? So what's the mean follow-up? 3, 4, 5 years. Not too long. Okay, so let's look at these incredible outcome data. Okay, so they're all explanatory trials. They're all using frequentist statistics, which Dr. Robinson is disparaging, and I agree. Okay, they're all testing null hypothesis. They're all, I would say, trivial. Some would say small. I would say pretty trivial effect sizes. That's my opinion. Very limited duration of benefit. Improbable internal validity. And the external validity is really open to question for your patients in Western Massachusetts in 2016. Now, the one thing you can say, and this is not what Dr. Thompson said, but this is said by other lecturers. For example, somebody was lecturing here about a year ago or about 8 months ago on statins and diabetes, said, well, yeah, Jeff, but all these trials are going the same way, okay? They are all going the same way. But, then you got to deal with publication bias, the file drawer problem. Some of these they tend to publish studies, perhaps, that are positive. So here's a paper from BMG Open. They looked at 2012, and their conclusion is that studies that are published by sponsors, journals, and researchers tend to show favorable or statistically significant results. So selective trial dissemination can distort the medical evidence, and it's really challenging for us as physicians to know what to do with your patient, okay? I'm not worried about the prescription guideline writers or the payers or the formulary decision makers. I'm worried about you people out there facing your patient across your desk or in your clinic to know what to recommend to provide the right drugs for the right patients. So application to clinical practice. The overall results of a large randomized clinical trial are not, this is right from clinical trials in cardiology, are not to be taken as a mandate for their automatic application to an individual patient. And that truth hasn't changed since 1997.